All right, so I'm doing the screencast in the middle of study hours, so I have to be a little bit quiet because I'm going to bother Anyton if I'm too noisy, right?
Yeah.
So you can see here that we're going to be talking about different types of natural selection. And on Tuesday in class, we did that natural selection simulation. And in fact, you today on Wednesday were given the assignment to complete the questions that you have to turn in by 5 o'clock p.m., which I hope you've done if it is past 5 at this point. And so now what I need to do is take us a bit further with that by talking to you about these four different types of natural selection. So the first type of natural selection is the one that was inferred from the lab that we did, and that's called directional selection. Oh, I'm going to pause it and write this out. Jesus, my handwriting sucks. I need to get a special glove thing I have here. Okay, so directional selection is exactly what it sounds like it is. It's going to move the behavior or characteristic of the organism in a particular direction away from some ancestral trait or behavior. So if you were to show this in a graph and you were looking at sort of the population, and the x-axis here is time, and you were to write, let's say, over here, this is the number of individuals and what you were to show, actually, I'm sorry, this isn't time. This is, oh, Chang, gosh, what a mess. I guess you could say this is sort of like the range of the characteristic. And this is going to seem really odd, but let's just imagine that we have here the characteristic is small here and it's large here. So if I were to take a look at this population, remember that we have variability among the individuals in a population. I would actually have sort of a frequency distribution curve that would look something like this. So most of the organisms, the highest number of organisms would be right around here, and there really wouldn't be that much variation to either side. You'd have some extremes sort of down in this area here that I'm marking with the asterisk, with the black asterisk, and then extreme over here towards the large size. But you can see here that in terms of the vast majority of the population, they're going to fall inside this area here. Okay? So whatever that particular characteristic is, it seems like it's a relatively small characteristic. The key to this is that directional selection, there is some sort of force out there that is going to push this whole population towards a larger, in this case, characteristic, whatever that is. So this whole curve is going to then shift, and you could imagine coming back after a million years or so, and this curve would be displaced over here towards the right side. So overall, the majority of the organisms will have increased the size of their claw or the size of their mane or whatever it might be. Okay, so this is directional selection because it's moving, the whole curve is moving from one direction, say on the left side, towards the right side. So let's look at an example of something like this. So what we're looking at here is the cactus. So not the wild boar that eats the cactus, but the actual cactus itself right here. And in sort of the first time period, the early ancestors of this cactus, you can see that for the most part, they were centering around themselves with around 90 spines, and then you'd have some extremes that had fewer and some extremes that had way more than 90. And then we would come back, 10,000 years later, we will have seen that this whole population has shifted towards having a greater number of spines, which you could imagine makes a lot of sense because if this hairy dude here, this choate wild boar, was chowing on you, the more spines you had, the least amount of, the less your predation impact would be. And so those things that would have more spines would survive and reproduce and produce. And as long as the spine number was something that was heritable, then you could imagine that there's going to be a lot of pressure to increase the spines over time. So natural selection forced this in one direction. Again, perfect example of directional selection. Okay, let's look at the second type of the four types of natural selection. This one's called stabilizing selection. And again, it says pretty much what you're going to imagine it actually is. So here are my axes. Again, I'm going to have the same set of axes here where I have the number of individuals on my y-axis, and on my x-axis I'm going to have the spectrum of characteristic. And I'm going to just do a slightly different, instead of large or smaller, I'm going to say low and high. Okay, with stabilizing selection, let's have the same population. So let's imagine that we have a population and we were to look at the particular characteristic, I don't even care what it is, it would look something like this. So notice here that we have a pretty good range here. The distance between these two asterisks is quite a bit greater than what we saw with the distance, oh, where is that thing? Oh, is it gone? Oh, there it is. Okay. The distance between these, right? So it's not really something you could measure, but the distance there is very different from the distance here. So that means we have a much broader range of this particular characteristic in this population. We actually have quite a few that are on the low end of the spectrum and quite a few that are in the high end of the spectrum. So I'll just sort of color this in here. Look at all these individuals over here on the low end extreme, and then you can see we got a huge number of individuals at the high end of the extreme. If we go back to this one, you can see that we have very few of those individuals, right? So if I were to do that same thing with the hash marks, there's really not much going on here. These are our extremes, and they are going to exist in the population because of the variation that exists among organisms and potentially mutations, etc. But for the most part, let's imagine that it looks like this. The green and the blue areas there are showing a lot of those extremes. So what stabilizing selection does is it actually pushes the force. Okay, natural selection is going to force this towards the center, cutting off those extremes on the low end and on the high end, so that if you were to come back and view this population 10,000 years later, it's going to look something like this, which looks a lot like these dudes, right? Sort of rather than having a fat haystack, it's a thin and narrow haystack here. So it's stabilized along this central, most of the things are going to be along this central medium size or medium amount of that particular characteristic. So let's look at an example for this one. Oh, shoot. Hold on. Okay. So you can see here that natural selection is going to favor this, I don't know, much sky blue colored butterfly, and these will be selected against the extremes. The light blue and the navy blue butterflies will be preyed upon. Perhaps they'll be easier to see because the background happens to be sort of sky blue tree bark or something crazy like that. So the light blue ones are going to stand out and the dark blue ones will stand out. So they'll get clipped on either extreme, which will force over time the population to assume this blue color that's in the center. Okay, so there we have stabilizing selection as our second. Let's take a look at our third. So this disruptive selection one is really cool because ultimately it's what gives rise to speciation, having two species be different from another enough that they essentially have different ancestry. Well, they're still going to have the common ancestor, but they start breaking away and having separate what are called gene pools. And geez, I'm trying to think. I didn't cover that stuff with you guys yet. The concept of genetic drift and um, gene flow. I got to cover that soon. Anyway, so if we were to graph this, this is going to look, we're going to have the exact same set of axes here. Okay, so with disruptive selection here, we are going to have, and again, I decided to choose characteristic as light and heavy here. So we initially see a population that perhaps looks something like this. So it's a pretty broad bell curve here. Most individuals are going to have this medium characteristic, but you are going to have a good number in these extremes out here. Okay, and it turns out that the thing that is favored through natural selection are the extremes. So that it's the center portion that's selected against. So it's, in a sense, the reverse of the stabilizing selection here. So there's some sort of force that's going to, and through natural selection, there's some selective force that's going to eliminate those middles and favor the ones on the outer edges. So that if you were to come back after a few millennia, you're going to see a combination that looks something like this. It'll have this double hump. So you'll have a rare group in the middle here that probably won't do so well, and the greatest combination you'll have, or the greatest representation in the individuals, will be at the extreme, or extreme opposite of one another. So you'll have a bunch of light in this case and a bunch of heavy and very few mediums. So where do we see that? Not the best photo here, but this is the sort of Darwin's finches that we have going on here. It turns out that the beak length has a lot to do with the type of food that's available to these finches. I'm not even sure if these are finches, but we can pretend they are here. So we're going to have this double hump situation here. These little guys over here are really good at picking out and eating the small seeds, or the insects perhaps, anything that's pretty small, and they need to get their smaller little beaks into smaller crevices to get things. Whereas these guys over here were put on islands that perhaps had large nuts that needed to be cracked with a heavy bill or heavy beak. So it favored not this middle one that would starve, right? Because it really can't do a good job of getting insects, and also it doesn't do a great job of breaking through the tough shells of the nuts. And it favors, natural selection favors those two extremes. All right, so the last one is called sexual selection. By the way, you can imagine that as I was searching online for images for sexual selection, it's a dangerous thing to do. Don't even try it. Okay, so for sexual selection, there's no graph to show this, but what you should understand with sexual selection is that, as you all saw with mating displays, sometimes those mating displays become more and more extreme, and as a result, if it's the male who's making those mating displays and the female who's selecting that mate, the female will get more and more selective, looking for the crazier and more extreme or larger of those displays or size of the male. And as a result, the males who aren't big or don't have the great displays aren't going to be able to pass as many genes on to the next generation, because they're not going to have children, since nobody's going to want to mate with them. And only those that are the biggest and showiest of the organisms are going to be able to mate and therefore propagate and be able to have many more of their offspring go into the next generation. Are you
This is Screencast?
Yeah. Yeah. Hey,
My
Ted's
goodness.
here. Ted's
Hi,
here
Jane.
listening to this. What time is it, you guys?
Like 8:55.
Oh, okay, you dirtballs. Ted, don't you want to say hi? You're
Yeah.
going to say hi to yourself? Is that weird?
Hi, Ted.
Okay. So with sexual selection, what that's going to do is lead to something called runaway selection. And runaway selection is when you start to see these extremes. And those extremes can show up in something like that's called sexual dimorphism, where you see completely different males and females. The males either are bigger or they're showier, etc. So it's cool. So let's take a look at example here. So all of these are examples of sexual dimorphism. The male lion is huge compared to the female, and it also has this ridiculous mane that is what is used by the females to select the most fit of the males, having the giant mane. Back to, I think it was Ellie and Morgan who did the frigate bird, and the larger of these pouches, they're called gular pouches. You guys are allowed to correct me if that's the case. I can't remember. The more red and larger they are, the more attractive they are going to be to the females, and so therefore it's going to push having larger, brighter red gular pouches. If you see this ptarmigan here, the beauty of the plumage there, it gets more showy. And in fact, you might think that this is sort of an empty promise, right? Why would you make yourself really showy? Does it say anything about how good a parent you're going to be? Does it say anything about your genes? Well, in some sense it does, because if you can be a male that can be this stinking showy, that means you also must be pretty able to escape from predators who are going after you. So it's not completely an empty promise here. And then we can see here with this elk, the more points that an elk has in its antlers, the more attractive it's going to be. Not only that, it'll be able to defend its territory and beat out other rivals because it has a much larger rack, etc. Okay, so sexual selection is a type of directional selection, of course, but I want to tease it out here because it's a little bit unusual since it sort of becomes crazy. It becomes sort of an arms race of one-upsmanship among, in this case, males in all these cases. Okay, bye.